Walker's presentation this evening. There's a reception with complimentary coffee and cookies, and you're all invited to join us on the third floor, more or less overhead. Those of you who have bought copies of Mr. Walker's books and would like them to sign them will have an opportunity. Also, we have a book table up there by the drinking fountain. The bookstore is offering us a good deal on cost of the books. You can buy the books for $6 each if you would like, if that's convenient for you this evening. Our guest tonight, Lars Walker, grew up on a farm in southeastern Minnesota. He attended Waldorf College in Iowa, and to some extent modeled the fictitious Christiania College of his novel Wolftime on that institution. Lars is a graduate of Augsburg College in Minneapolis. He has packed crab meat in Alaska, worked in radio broadcasting, traveled in Norway and Iceland, and has written 3 fantasy novels published by Bain Books. His first book, Erlingsword, is now incorporated with The Ghost of the God Tree in one volume called The Year of the Warrior. In addition to his day job as a communications resource person for the Association of Free Lutheran Churches in Minneapolis, Lars continues to write. His most recent novel, Blood and Judgment, is now with the publisher. Here again, his imagination draws upon what might seem to be disparate sources to create a unified and exciting novel. In his writing, Lars draws upon his immersion in the mythology, folklore, history, and literature of medieval Scandinavia, plus insights into the craft of heroic fantasy that was written in our own modern times, adding to them a keen interest in flesh and blood human beings whom we come to care about as we read his books. I'm eagerly looking forward to Lars's 5th novel, which he's now working on, which will take the hero of The Year of the Warrior to Vinland, the New World. Vikings were famous for magnificently carved ships, for their courage, and what was the other thing? For stealing things. I'd like to steal a few words that were written about another writer of fantasy in these post-Tolkien years and apply them to our guest this evening. Once wolves did pace just beyond the edge of the firelight, and all terrors slithered in the dark. Once talismans given by supernatural powers armed heroes and made men the conquerors of supernatural darkness. Some of us yearn to see a strong Carl's prophecies fulfilled, and all honor to such a singer of saga tales who can make it come so alive on pages between book covers. Please welcome Lars Walker to Mayville State University.
Thank you, Dale. If I had not been speaking, I would still have wanted to be here tonight. This has been very interesting. And I hope that even if my talk is a disappointment, you will have enjoyed what we've seen already as much as I have. I have no visual aids except myself. This is a fairly authentic example of what a moderately prosperous Northland might have worn about the year 1000 AD. Authenticity is a sliding scale. You can sell all that you have and deliver your body to be burned, and you still won't satisfy some people, but from a distance, this works. To get these festivities started, I'd like to share a passage from the Heims Kringla, the Sagas of the Kings of Norway, written by the Icelander Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. This isn't the whole book. This is one of 3 volumes. This is from the Saga of St. Olaf. There was an Iceland man by name Torara Nefjolfsson, who had his relations in the north of the country. He was not of high birth, but particularly prudent, eloquent and agreeable in conversation with people of distinction. He was also a far-traveled man who had been long in foreign parts. Thorarin was a remarkably ugly man, principally because he had very ungainly limbs. He had great ugly hands, and his feet were still uglier. Thorarin was in Tonsberg when this event happened, which has just been related, and he was known to King Olaf by their having had conversations together. Thorarin was just then done with rigging out a merchant vessel which he owned, and with which he intended to go to Iceland in the summer. King Olaf had Thorarin with him as a guest for some days, and conversed much with him, and Thorarin even slept in the king's lodgings. One morning early, the king awoke while the others were still sleeping. The sun had newly risen in the sky, and there was much light within. The king saw that Thorarin had stretched out one of his feet from under the bedclothes, and he looked at the foot a while. In the meantime, the others in the lodging awoke, and the king said to Thorarin, "I have been awake for a while, and have seen a sight which was worth seeing. A man's foot, so ugly that I do not think an uglier can be found in this entire merchant town." Thereupon he told the others to look at it and see if this was not so, and all agreed with the king. When Thorarin observed that what they were all talking about, he said, "There are a few things for which you cannot find a match, and this may be the case here." The king says, "I would rather say that another such ugly foot cannot be found in the town, and I would lay any wager upon it." Then said Thorarin, "I am willing to bet that I shall find an uglier foot still in the town." The king said, "Then he who wins shall have the right to get any demand from the other he chooses to make." "Be it so," said Thorarin. Thereupon he stretches out his other foot from under the bedclothes, and it was in no way handsomer than the other, and moreover wanted the big toe. "There," said Thorarin, "see now came my other foot, which was so much uglier, and besides lacks the big toe. Now I have won." The king replies, "That other foot was so much uglier than this one, by having 5 ugly toes, and this has only 4. And now I have won the choice of asking something from thee." I don't know what your reaction is if you hear that story, but I can tell you my reaction as I read it. 2 things impress me. First of all, I'm surprised to find a story like this in a book written in the 13th century. Most literature written in Europe in that period followed Latin models, and indeed was written in Latin. It aimed at elegance and high rhetoric. This is the kind of story your Uncle Arnie might tell after a weekend ice fishing. Second, the story seems to me to have a quality that might be called the ring of truth. I get a strong feeling from it that if I haven't actually had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall observing day-to-day life in King Olaf's household, I've at least got a pretty good transcription here of the story as Thorarin Ethilson told it to his grandchildren on long winter nights in Iceland. I feel as if I've achieved a modest kind of time travel. The wall between the past and the present seems to wear very thin here. It reminds me that books are magic in something more than a metaphorical sense. It recalls to me the scene in the movie Black Robe, where a French missionary in colonial Canada communicates with another Frenchman through a written note, and their Native American guides are terrified by what is obviously sorcery. And in a sense, they're right. Literature is a kind of necromancy. Through books, we communicate with the dead. They can't hear us, but we can hear them, often pretty clearly. Isn't it interesting that we tend to speak of authors, even whether they're dead or alive, in the present tense when we quote them? I tend to say St. Paul says in Romans, or Snorri says in the Heimskringla. I don't say St. Paul said, or Snorri said. It's not something we think about, it's just something we naturally do, and we're kind of surprised when it's brought to our attention. The question of whether the voices we hear in the sagas are actually the voices of the people concerned is in fact a central question to saga studies. In the 200 years or so that the Icelandic sagas have been a part of the general treasury of European literature, I mean the time since they've been translated and available to non-Icelanders, they've gone through three stages or periods of criticism. The first period, which began in the early 19th century, might be called the Period of Inherency. In this period, it was assumed that the sagas provided a pretty accurate account of the actual events, characters, and conversations they describe. It's easy to understand how critics might think this way. As we noted with the story about Ferrarin and his toe, these stories bear the ring of truth. The characters talk in recognizable ways you might expect real people to talk. The most heroic or even superhuman characters tend to understate things, as in a famous scene in the Heinz Kringla, where the Icelanders Tormod Kolbrunarskald, who was wounded in the Battle of Stiklestad, where St. Olaf died, pulls an arrow out of his own chest with a pair of tongs, examines the head and says, "The king has fed us well. I'm fat even in the heart roots," and then falls over dead. The chief proponents of the inheritist view were Norwegians. And while it's easy to understand how they would look at the sagas this way, it needs to be noted that there were some political impulses involved too. This was the time in history when Norway was struggling for independence, first from the Kingdom of Denmark and then from the Kingdom of Sweden. The sagas are to a large extent immigrant literature, like Ole Rollbach's Giants in the Earth. They were written by a transplanted population that was overwhelmingly Norwegian. And like many of us here today, these immigrants thought of themselves as Norwegians, though not in a political sense. They took an active interest in current events and history of the old country. And this interest is obvious everywhere in the sagas. Even if the hero of the saga is an Icelander, chances are he will go to Norway at some point in his career. And it's almost pathetic how we're told again and again how highly honored all these Icelanders were at the Norwegian court. There seems to be a certain element of wishful thinking there. So when the Norwegian scholars looked at the sagas, they saw many things that bore witness to a Norwegian golden age, an age of kings and military glory, when Norway was not only an independent nation, but a nation to be feared, a major player. To them, this was proof positive that Norway was an ancient kingdom with an ancient tradition, worthy to take its place once again on the game board of the great game of Europe. But time went on and fashions changed, and in the late 19th century, the textual critical theory of literary scholarship became the new orthodoxy, and its methods were applied to the sagas, and we entered the period of skepticism. People began to notice the genealogies don't always match from one saga to another. They noticed that the same incidents are described differently in different sagas. A famous instance of that is the discovery of America, or at least the first sighting of America, which is credited to Bjarni Herjolfsson in the Greenlander saga, but to Leif Erikson in Eric the Red saga. Contrary-wise, sometimes different events are suspiciously similar. Tormod Kolbrunarskald's dying words about being fat around the heart roots are repeated almost word for word by Leif Erikson's brother Torvald as he is dying from an Indian arrow in America. And not surprisingly, there was a political motivation for this approach as well. Rather surprisingly, some of the foremost scholars who questioned the historical accuracy of sagas were themselves Icelanders. Their concerns were different from the concerns of the Norwegians before them. They had no claim to ever having been a kingdom or a major European power. Their pride was in the sagas themselves as works of art. They felt that if the sagas were just bald narratives of root fact, that there would be little in them to boast about. But if the sagas were works of fiction, the first historical novels, then the Icelanders could say, look, we are people capable of producing great art. even as a tiny, struggling community on the periphery of Europe, we wrote books that were years ahead of their time. The first historical novels. And that proves that we're a vital culture, worthy of independence from Denmark. And they had a point. It was no accident that Sir Walter Scott, the inventor of the modern historical novel, was an avid reader of Icelandic sagas. More recently, some scholars have begun to adopt a new view of the sagas. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I tend to agree with this view because I do my best never to agree with anything that's fashionable if I can help it. But when your Uncle Arnie comes home from ice fishing with a story about Cousin Carl and his toe, you know that he may have embroidered it a bit, but you don't usually doubt that it's based on true events, as they say in the movies. Today's saga scholar views the sagas as an interesting amalgam of genuine tradition and artistic creation. With the help of archaeology and textual analysis, historians find the sagas a useful source of information, though they don't generally believe anything on saga evidence alone. And literary scholars tell us what we already knew, that the sagas are great stories. They're readable, compelling, and surprisingly contemporary. Now, having said all that, I'm going to suddenly contradict myself and say something that's paradoxical but also true. In spite of what I've said about how well the sagas read to the modern mind, there are senses in which the sagas are very hard for us to understand. The style of the sagas is pretty easy if we skip over the long genealogy. But the motivations of the characters are a world away. The Vikings lived in a very different world from ours. Their ethic was based on honor, not equality. In our present world, as we happen to be involved in a struggle with an enemy who is in many ways closer to the Vikings than we are, we often find it very difficult to understand our opponents. Surprisingly, reading the sagas might help. The Vikings, as I said, lived in an honor culture. Honor cultures are based on the avoidance of shame. Everything that a man or a woman does in an honor culture is intended to enhance prestige and stave off the unendurable prospect of shame. To be shamed is the intolerable thing. You see this again and again in the sagas. It's intolerable not only for me, but for my family and everyone involved with me. Death is infinitely preferable to living with shame. We wonder how people in certain cultures today can kill their pregnant daughters or send their children off to blow themselves out. It's all about honor and shame, or at least it's largely about honor and shame. To understand this is to begin to understand our enemies and also to understand the sagas. Now, this is a problem for an author like me who wants to write about Vikings. Although I enjoy novels and movies about Vikings, to be honest, there aren't many good ones, in my opinion. The ones I see tend to be a little clunky. That's because of the ethical distance between our culture and an honor culture. When I set out to write my books, I couldn't figure out at first how to bridge this gap until I hit on the idea of a non-heroic narrative. Now, I didn't invent that device. I think George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman books probably had a strong subconscious influence on me. But once I came up with the idea of a narrator who is not a man of honor, who has been a slave, I knew then that I could make the story work. The hero of my novels is, this copy was damaged and flooded in my apartment, so it's good enough for me to use for reading. The hero of my novels is Erling Skjaldsson, who was an actual historical figure. He was a major player in the Norwegian political scene in the times of King Olaf Tryggvason and Saint Olaf Haraldsson. Erling is everything the Viking hero ought to be. He's brave, handsome, tall. He's honorable as an Arab sheikh. A man like Erling would have fought at the drop of a hat and spent the bulk of his life without experiencing a serious moment of self-doubt. A great hero, a man that warriors would follow to hell and back. A rotten main character for a book. Not only do modern Americans have a hard time understanding a man like Erling, they have a hard time believing a man like Erling ever existed. That's why I invented my narrator, Father Allel. Father Allel is an Irishman, which in itself doesn't help a lot, since in that time an Irishman would have been as honor-bound as a Viking. But Father Allel has been a slave, and he has had his spirit crushed to some extent. He's not confident, as Erling is. He's afraid of dying. He has grave doubts about himself and even about his faith. He is, in short, a modern man. And as a modern man, he can speak to modern people in their own language. From the point of view of a Viking, this language is the language of a slave. If Erling Skjaldsson or Olaf Tryggvason could be here with us today, if they could talk to us and get to know us a little, they would probably conclude that we're all slaves. Well-dressed slaves, well-fed slaves, but slaves nonetheless. They might envy our possessions, but they wouldn't envy our attitude. To illustrate what I mean about honor, I'd like to read a short passage from the Year of the Warrior. This scene takes place at Erling Skjaldsson's home of Sola, which is near where Stavanger, Norway is today. And it takes place in his hall while he's feasting with his warriors. A singular thing happened before we were finished. A strange man rushed into the hall with a spear in his hand and cast it through the body of one of the men at the table across the hearthway. Everyone was up in a moment, and I vaulted our table, leaped over the fire, and pushed through the bodies to the stricken man whose friends had already laid him out on their table. At the same time, several of the woolly boys seized the intruder and began knocking him about. I couldn't recall whether I'd seen the wounded man in church or not, and I was asking him if he was a Christian and wanted last rites, but the noise was too great for me to hear his answer. Erling's shout finally brought quiet. "Silence!" he roared. "Stop hitting! Hold him until we know more. Father Allel, how is he?" "Nearly gone," said I. I spoke to the man. "Are you a Christian lad?" "No," he said. "I go with Thor. But I need to know why." Erling needed to know the same thing. His face was bright red. He had the attacker brought before the high seat. "My name is Arnor Bordsson," said the man. "I come from Tornheim Farm near Rondeberg." "Rondeberg is Kar's home," said Erling, referring to the man bleeding under my hands. "What's your quarrel with him?" "I was trying to say, my lord, before these men stopped my mouth, that I have slain Kar Torsteinsson lawfully in daylight and before witnesses in vengeance for the death of my brother Bjorgulf." Kar whispered, "I know nothing of Bjorgulf's death." "He says he knows nothing of it, my lord," I said to Erling. "What say you, Arnor?" Erling asked. "Within the last week, a feud has broken out between Tornheim and Rondeberg," Arnor answered. "It began with the killing of my cousin Osmond. Since then, 2 more men are dead of my family, and now 3 of theirs that I know of. I've been a day traveling. Kar has no part in any crimes against you. He's the greatest warrior of his family. It was more honorable to kill him than some weakling. Did you think that it might make you a powerful enemy to kill one of my bodyguard before my own eyes in my own hall? I know you for an honorable lord, Erling Skjaldsson. You'll not have a man slain out of hand for a lawful killing." "Don't chop law with me," Erling almost whispered. "You killed a man of my own in my own hall without giving him any chance to defend himself. I can take you out and have you hanged and never pay an ounce of manhood." "My lord, may I speak?" said Halvard Thorfinnsson, who sat on our bench down near the women's end. "What has this to do with you, Halvard?" asked Erling. "Arnor is kin to me. I, too, knew nothing of this feud, but I beg you to accept self-judgment and ask you to name what price you'll take for the offense. It's unwise for young warriors to make pleas for the enemies of their lords. Arnor is no enemy of yours, Lord Erling, unless you'll have it so. His fight is with the Rondebergers. He has acted rashly, but it was a bold deed nonetheless. There will be blood enough shed before this business is over with. You can leave the killing to us." Erling's face had gone back to its wonted color. "The man's vote for killing a lord is 36 aura," he said. I'll have no less for this offense to me. Our king will pay it. I do not like these feuds in my lands, Halvard. They waste men and wealth. a man must have vengeance for his kin, said our car died, and there was blood everywhere. My final thought, I guess, is that following the atrocity of September 11th in New York, a lot of people in the entertainment business seem to have had a rare moment of clarity. And you heard people asking the question whether the sort of entertainment, the sort of material they were producing was really of any use in a world such as our world had suddenly become. And it might be a sign of my own superhuman self-complacency, but I never had a moment of doubt whether the sort of thing I'm writing is useful in times like these. I hope that's true. At this point, do we open it for questions? If you have any questions, I'd be happy to share my ignorance with you.
Yes, if you have some questions for Lars, please speak up. And actually, I'm going to start with one. You mentioned, Lars, that a number of the characters in The Year of the Warrior are real people. So did that constrain you as far as your means of writing a plot that would be satisfying to people who aren't really interested in historical minutiae, who just want a good story? Did you have to make compromises?
Yes. That's the short answer. I have, although this is fantasy, I have tried to make it as historically accurate as I possibly could. I've spent many years studying the subject, and which is not to say it's perfect, but that doesn't mean that sometimes I didn't twist things a bit. One thing that immediately leaps to my mind is that in Heinz Friedel, I read that when King Olaf Tryggvason first came to Norway from England, he ended at Moster Island and then went north to Nidaros, which is Trondheim. And I thought, that's great, because Moster is just north of where Aaron Schultzen lived, and I can easily have them meet at that point, and I wanted them to have an encounter at that point in the story. And so I wrote it that way, and then I discovered later on that there were two Moster Islands, and the one he actually sailed to was considerably north. So I thought a bit, and I changed the itinerary a little. I had Erling land where he said he would landed at the northern Moster, but then I had to go south to make contact with some relatives who lived to the south of where Aaron Schultzen lived, which gave me plenty of opportunity to run into each other. And then I had to say once again, at Snorri, I can do that. Also, King Olaf Tryggvason had a 5-year reign, but in my book it's a 4-year reign because I had a year there that I had no use for, so I threw it out. No one's ever noticed. Yes. This is a larger subject that I'm qualified to talk about, but that never stopped me before. Actually, in a sociological sense, as I understand it, shame is very common in non-Christian societies. In fact, it's almost universal in warrior societies. You see it in Japanese Bushido. You see it in the Native American warrior culture. Wherever you have a warrior culture, the honor-shame system seems to operate. Christianity tends instead to produce a guilt attitude where one is more concerned about one's own rightness as opposed to an abstract standard of right or wrong. In a shame culture, there is no particular advantage to admitting that you have done wrong. You either get revenge or you find a way to blame someone else for what you may have done, because any other course would tend to bring shame on you. If there is, in an honor culture, there is no premium given for confession of sin. There is no honor in that. That did create a problem in the conversion to Christianity. It was not unique to the Scandinavians. The Scandinavians were not really that different from the Anglo-Saxons. Their conversion just happened later than the Anglo-Saxon conversion. And also other warrior societies, the Germanic, Teutonic tribes, which had been converted earlier, they had all been through this process. A large part of it seems to have involved viewing Christ in a different way than the way we look at Christ. They did not see Christ so much as the suffering sacrifice, but as the victorious warrior. The cavalry, in their view, was a battle, and Christ had gone into unarmed combat in the battle and defeated the enemy. Looking at it this way, it made it more acceptable to the Viking ethos. And of course, they looked across Europe. They saw the things that were happening in Europe. They saw magnificent buildings, at least by their standards, going up in Europe. They saw the tremendous wealth of England, which was incredibly prosperous at the time. They wanted those things. The other Europeans told them, well, we have them because God has blessed us, because we are Christians. That counted a lot with the Vikings. Is that any any use to you? More questions? Yes. I first started reading them. I read the Heinz Springler in college, which is kind of a special case. It's quite different. Heinz Springler is a collection of sagas rather than a single saga. But and then later on, as I went into college, I began to read some of the sagas. What is most interesting? The human interaction, I guess. These are stories about people dealing with conflicts in a frontier culture. There was no king in Iceland, there was no king but the law, and there was no government force to enforce the law in Iceland. You could get a judgment from the thing or the all thing. The things were district courts. The all thing was the court, and it was both a law court and a legal assembly and lawmaking body for the entire country, and that was the government of the country. They governed by consensus. It was very democratic. There was no executive or police force to carry out a judgment. If you got the court to award you money from someone who had harmed you, if you got someone outlawed who had done injury to you, you yourself were responsible to see that you and your friends and relatives were actually responsible to see that that was carried out. The government would not help you. And if for some reason you couldn't do that, again, you brought shame on yourself. So it's all about personal interaction. It's all about people playing back and forth with power. You've got clever men who manipulate the law. You've got strong men who are not so clever, who try to get by with the strength of their arm and their prowess in battle. As a general rule, the clever men do a little better than the warriors. But it's drama, it's conflict, and it's that's what drama is. Drama is conflict.
Lars, I think this evening you may have given the impression that your novels are driven more by historical factors than they feel themselves to be when one actually reads them. When one reads them, one becomes captivated by an engrossing plot and a tumbling swirl of characters. How do you, as a writer, as a craftsman, what principles do you use, I guess, when you have to make a choice between that part of you that wants authenticity and that part of you that wants to tell a story that people can't put down, that keeps them up way past bedtime, which I've experienced in reading your books on a number of occasions?
That hasn't been as much a problem as you might fear. These were extremely dramatic times. This was a time of social ferment, not only the conversion to Christianity, but the associated establishment of a monarchy. Establishing a central monarchy in Norway was a process that took many generations. It's probably not surprising to many people here that it was very difficult to kick it in Norway. It was very difficult to get people who were used to a certain amount of liberty and local autonomy to bow to a central authority. That is one of the central themes of this. This is what Erling Schultz is all about. He is a local herser, a local magnate. Well, he's not actually local. He has power over a very large section of southwest Norway. And that power is power that he feels belongs to his by right. He has inherited it. And kings come along and they want that power to be subject to theirs. They want him to rule as their representative. And that's a central conflict which goes on and on and on through Erling's life, through several changes of government. Erling remains there, ruling Skifto, and defying kings to do whatever they dare against him, until finally, later on down the road, Erling. I'm writing these books on schedule. Actually, this book ends in the year 1000, and it was published in 2000. So I'm trying to keep along with the years. If that goes on, I have to keep writing until 2030 or so, when I will be 80. Assuming I live that long. But this conflict of Erling's life recurs again and again with different characters and different personalities. Finally, his final greatest enemy is St. Olaf Haraldsson. We tend to look at St. Olaf as the great Christian hero of Norway. He died trying to convert Norway. But many of King Olaf's enemies, including Erling Schultz, were Christians. They were opposed to his politics, not his